Czech literature is the literature written by Czechs mostly in the Czech language, although other languages like Old Church Slavonic, Latin and German have been also used, especially in the past, such as by author Franz Kafka, who while bilingual in Czech and German, wrote his works in German. Czech literature is divided into roughly 10 main time periods: the Middle Ages, the Hussite period, the years of re-Catholicization, and the baroque, the Enlightenment and Czech reawakening in the 19th century, the avant-garde, the interwar period, the years under Communism and the Prague Spring, and the literature of the post-communist Czech Republic. Czech literature and culture played a notable role on at least 2 occasions when Czech society lived under oppression and little to no political activity was possible. On both of these occasions, in the early 19th century and then again in the 1960s, the Czechs used the cultural and literary effort to create political freedom and to establish a confident, politically aware nation. Middle Ages. Literature in the Czech lands was founded in the 8th century AD, in the Kingdom of Greater Moravia. The saints Constantine and Methodius, sent by the Byzantine Emperor Michael III to complete the Christianization of the kingdom, created the first written Slavic language, Old Church Slavonic, written in the Glagolitic alphabet. Their translations of Latin liturgy into Slavonic are the earliest surviving literature sources created in the Czech lands. After the collapse of Greater Moravia at the end of the 9th century, the political and cultural orientation of the Bohemian lands shifted from Byzantium to Rome. Very little is known about the next 2 centuries of literary development. Fragments of works exist, but many are simply inferred from citations in works found elsewhere. The close of the century heralded the ultimate victory of Latin over Old Church Slavonic as the official language of liturgy and culture in Moravia and Bohemia, and cultural alliance shifted from east to west. The legend of Christian, written in Latin verse in the latter half of the 10th century, describing the lives of Saints Ludmila and Wenceslas, is the greatest surviving work. Its authenticity, however, is under some dispute. In the pre-Muslim Bohemia of the 12th and early 13th century, all preserved literary works are written in Latin. Historical chronicles and hagiographies comprise the majority of works preserved. Bohemian hagiographies focus exclusively on Bohemian saints, although numerous legends about Bohemian saints were also written by foreign authors. The most important chronicle of the period is the Chronica Bohemorum by Cosmas, though it does approach its topics with then contemporary politics in mind, and attempts to legitimize the ruling dynasty. Cosmas' work was updated and extended by several authors in the latter part of the 12th and during the 13th centuries. During the first part of the 13th century, the pre-Muslim rulers of Bohemia expanded the political and economic influence westward and came into contact with the political and cultural kingdoms of Western Europe. This cultural exchange was evident in literature through the introduction of German courtly poetry, or Minnesang. In the latter part of the 13th century, after the murder of Wenceslas III and the subsequent upheavals in the kingdom in 1306, however, the Bohemian nobles distanced themselves from German culture and looked for literature in the native language. Despite this, German remained an important literary language in Bohemia until the 19th century. This new literature in Czech consisted largely of epic poetry of 2 types, the legend and the knightly epic, both based on apocryphal tales from the Bible as well as hagiographic legends of earlier periods. Prose was also first developed during this period, administrative and instructional texts, which necessitated the development of a more extensive and specialized vocabulary. The first Czech Latin dictionaries date from this time. Extensive chronicles, of which the Chronicle of Dalamal and Chronicon Orly Regia are the most striking examples, and artistic prose were also written. The Hussite era. The Hussite revolution of the 15th century created a definite break in the literary evolution of Czech literature and forms its own separate history within Czech literature. The main aim of this literature was to communicate and argue for a specific religious doctrine, and its form was generally prose. Jan Hus' theological writing first appears at the beginning of the 15th century. He wrote first in Latin, later in Czech, and this divide remained for much of the later period. Poetry and intellectual prose used primarily Latin, whereas popular prose was written in Czech and German. Hus' writings center on technical, theological questions. However, he did publish a set of his Czech sermons and created rules of orthography and grammar that would be used to create the foundations of modern Czech. In the 17th and 18th centuries, only fragments remain of the literary works of the radical Taborite faction. These were generally Latin apologia defending the Taborite doctrine. In general, Hussite writings differed from the preceding era by the focus on social questions. Their audience consisted of the lower and lower middle classes. Works defending Catholicism and attacking the Hussite utraquists were also written, one example being Jan Rokycana's works. The Hussite period for the first time also truly developed the genre of Czech religious songs as a replacement for Latin hymns and liturgy, e.g., the Jišibnický cancional, the Jišibnický hymnal. After the election of George of Poděbrady to the Czech throne following the Hussite Wars, a new cultural wave swept into Bohemia. Humanism saw in the classics of antiquity an ideal for literature and culture. The main feature of the literature of this period is the competition between Catholics writing in Latin, e.g., Bohuslav Husisčanský Zedlokovich and Jan Dubravius, and Protestants writing in Czech, e.g., Viktorin Kornel Zvch Ardian Václav Hajíček. New literary devices incited scholars, e.g., Velslaven, to construct a more complex grammatical structure based on Latin, as well as an influx of loan words. Gutenberg's printing press rendered books and pamphlets more accessible, which slowly changed literature's status in society. Baroque. The demise of the Czech Protestants after the Battle of the White Mountain decidedly affected Czech literary development. The forceful re-Catholicization and Germanization of Bohemia and the ensuing confiscations and expulsions virtually eliminated the Protestant middle classes and split the literature into two parts, the domestic Catholic and the émigré Protestant branches. Unlike in other European countries of the time, the nobility in Bohemia was not a part of the literary audience, and thus this split of literary effort led to a certain lack of development and stagnation of Czech Baroque literature in comparison to other European countries of the time, especially in genres that were written for noble courts. The largest personality of Czech evangelical Baroque writing is John Comenius, who spent his youth in Bohemia but was forced into exile later in life. He was a pedagogue, theologian, reformer of education, and philosopher. His works include grammars, theoretical tracts on education, and works on theology. With his death in the late 17th century, Protestant literature in the Czech language virtually disappeared. Catholic Baroque works span two types: religious poetry such as that of Adam Michna-Zedotradovich, Frederick Bridle and Václav Jan Rosa, and religious prose writings, and historical accounts, as well as the Jesuit St. Wenceslas Bible. The Enlightenment. At the end of the 18th century, the Bohemian lands underwent a considerable change. The Habsburg Emperor Joseph II put an end to the feudal system and supported a new religious and ideological tolerance. Enlightened classicism emerged, which sought to apply the principles of rational science to all aspects of daily life. A national culture and literature in one's own national language began to be seen as a prerequisite for the unification of a nation. In literature, this constituted a renewed interest in prose novels, in Czech history and in the historical development of Czech culture. The literary audience evolved from priests and monks to the laity and general public, and literature began to be seen as a vehicle of artistic expression. Bohemia and Moravia, however, remained within the sphere of Austrian and German cultural influence. The new national literature thus firstly mimicked popular German genres and would only later evolve into an independent creative effort. This was especially true for drama, e.g. Václav Klement Klisipiera, 19th century. Pre-Romanticism formed the transition between enlightened classicism and Romanticism. The pre-Romantics did not completely abandon the emphasis on poetic forms drawn from antiquity, but relaxed the strict separation between the genres and turned away from didactic genres toward more lyric, folk-inspired works. It was during this period that the idea of a truly national literature and culture developed, as a rejection of Bernard Bolzano's vision of a bilingual and bicultural Czech-German state. The perhaps greatest figure of this era is Josef Jungmann, who translated many classics of world literature and spent his life establishing Czech literature as a serious, rich literature capable of great development. František Palacký and Pavel Josef Safari took up the challenge of re-examining Czech history, as part of the effort to establish a pedigree for Czech literature and culture. Czech historians at the time sought evidence of heroic epics of the Middle Ages. They appeared to find such evidence in the Rukopis Královy Dvorsky and Rukopis Zelenohorsky, although both were later proven forgeries. By the 1830s, the foundations of Czech literature were laid, and authors now began to focus more on the artistic merits of the work and less on developing the idea of Czech literature and culture as a whole. During this time period, two main types of literature were produced: Biedermeier literature, which strove to educate the readers and encourage them to be loyal to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Romanticism, which emphasized the freedom of the individual and focused on subjectivity and the subconscious. These authors were generally published in either newspapers or in the literary magazine Koverty, published by Joseph Kajetin Tyl. The year 1848 brought to the fore a new generation of Czech authors who followed in the footsteps of Macha, and published the work in the new Almanac Marge. These authors rejected the narrow ideal of a purely national culture and favored one that incorporated Czech literature into European culture and drew inspiration from the progress made outside of the Czech lands. The work, however, also commented on the encroachment of industrialization and focused increasingly on the simple life as opposed to the unfettered romantic ideal. The May generation was followed by the neo-romantics, who continued in the romantic tradition, but also incorporated more contemporary styles: realism, symbolism, and decadence. Three periods are apparent. The first reacted to the disappointment due to the lack of political and social progress during the 1870s. The second was the great return to poetry, especially epic poetry, and the third focused on prose. In conversation with the neo-romantics, the next generation of authors leaned toward realism and naturalism, the ordinary and banal. They favored contemporary subjects over historical ones, and sought to de-emphasize the personal voice of the author in comparison to the often highly colored speech of the characters. Two main topics were of interest: the exploration of the Czech village and the extent to which it remained an oasis of good morals, and Prague, especially the life of the lower classes. The last literary generation of the 19th century signaled a decided break with the past and the advent of modernism, after the wave of optimism in the wake of the French Revolution at the beginning of the century. The lack of progress in implementing these ideals of freedom and brotherhood led to both of skepticism toward the possibility of ever achieving these ideals, and renewed efforts to do so. The common link between authors of this generation is their adherence to a particular style over their own voices, and their often very critical perspectives on the work of the previous generations. The modernists also inaugurated the cult of the artist, and this period saw the birth of the literary critic as an independent profession, as an ally of the artist, helping to both define and present work to the public. Notable poets of this period drew on the works and translations of the poet Jaroslav Urchliky and include, among others, Josef Svatopluk Maka, Antonin Sova, Ottokar Brezina, and Karel Levacek. Prose authors include Vilém Mrstik, Razina Svobodova, and Joseph Karel Sledger.